Welcome to this end of unit review on the Medicine on the Western Front unit. The aims of this lesson are to assess the knowledge of the topic that you have gained, to assess your understanding of the topic, and to assess your source skills, in particular, the most important component of this part of the Medicine Through Time course. Here's a do now task to get you warmed up. Which of the following saw greatest progress in World War I in your view? Explain your choice. As an extension, you could rank them all in order from greatest to least progress. Okay, pause the video here where you make your mind up. And by the way, if you couldn't do this task, you're probably not ready to take the end of unit review. So by all means go back and review some of the other lessons in this playlist. Pause the video while you complete the task and press play when you're ready to continue. Okay, how did you get on with that? If you found that pretty easy, you're probably ready to tackle the rest of this lesson. If so, let's proceed. In this end of unit review, I'm going to give you 4 questions which are based upon the style of questions that you would get in the Paper 1 exam on the Edexcel topic. If you're not doing the Edexcel exam board, you might find that the questions are phrased in a different way and have got different marking criteria. If that's the case, you might not want to do this, otherwise it could confuse you. However, it could still be a valuable opportunity to test your knowledge, but also to test your source skills in a more general way. I'll leave that up to you. However, like I say, I have prepared this more specifically for the Edexcel Paper 1 exam. I'm going to give you a rough time limit for each of these. However, you should be prepared to time yourself, perhaps using a stopwatch or on your phone. Otherwise, this lesson is just going to be a long video with lots of protracted silences. Instead, when you're ready to answer the question, press pause on the video and then press play when time is up. Let's have a look at question number 1, for which you should give yourself 6 minutes to answer the question. Unless you're entitled to extra time, of course, in which case, give yourself the extra time. Question number 1. Describe 2 features of the evacuation route on the Western Front. This is worth 4 marks. In the exam, you're given 2 spaces to write your answer. One is labelled feature 1, the other is labelled feature 2. You could pause the video here and begin your answer, or if you need a little bit more advice, just hang on and I'll give an example. So if you need the example, here's a bit of a tip. Imagine this was a question in paper 2, maybe on the Anglo-Saxons and Normans topic. So if this question was describe 2 features of a Motte and Bailey castle, this would be a pretty decent answer. Motte and Bailey castles had a bailey. The bailey contained the buildings that were used every day, like rooms for sleeping and stables for horses. Notice that in red I've given an example and in black I've given the supporting detail. 1 mark for the example, 1 mark for the supporting detail. Here's my second example and detail. They also had a motte. This was a mound with a tower or keep on top of it that could be defended in emergencies. Notice that you actually don't need to write that much of this. So if you get it done sooner than the 6 minutes, great, just move on. Okay, are you ready? Sorted yourself out with a timer? Well, in that case, press pause on the video now and then press play when you're ready to see question 2. Good luck. Done? How was that? That's probably the easiest of the answers. As long as you've got a pretty decent knowledge of the evacuation route on the Western Front, you should be fine. Later in this lesson, we'll have a look at some example answers, but for now, let's move on to question 2. For question 2, you're going to have 15 minutes to answer the question. Here it goes. It's a bit of a mouthful, so try and keep up. Question 2. Study sources A and B. How useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into the problems the medical services faced in transporting wounded soldiers? Explain your answer using sources A and B and your own knowledge of the historical context. Right, let's see how you would approach this question for 8 marks. In this question, you'll need to consider the content of each source, in other words, the information that it gives you, your own knowledge related to them, and the provenance of each source, in other words, its origin, who produced it and when, and the purpose, why it was produced. Remember to look at the ways that they are useful, how their usefulness might be limited, and explain how useful they are overall in relation to the inquiry in the question. And that's really important. Look back at the question again. The inquiry is problems the medical services faced in transporting wounded soldiers. So that's what you should be looking for. A good idea at this point might be to make this full screen and HD so that you can see it in maximum detail, as the text is quite small. Alternatively, you could take a screenshot, print a copy, and make some annotations on it like you'd be able to do in a real exam. Let's have a look at source A. From the recorded memories of William Easton, East Anglian Field Ambulance. He was 18 in 1916. Here he described the conditions near Ypres in 1917. Maybe I'll attempt to do an East Anglian accent of the period. It's a bit different to what you'd hear now. Up at Ypres we used to go up the line and we'd be waist deep in mud. We'd be carrying the wounded down near a place called Hooge, where there had been a terrific amount of fighting. One trip down a trench in those conditions and you'd be all in exhausted. If you got 2 or 3 wounded men down in a day, that was all you could expect to do. We had to carry men in 4s there, and we had to be very careful because you could do more damage to a man than the shell if you jolted him too much or if he fell off the stretcher. To make carrying easier, we had slings we would put around our shoulders and over the stretcher handles. Okay. So that maybe gives us some problems. You might want to pause the video here and make some notes of what about this source is relevant to the inquiry of the problems the medical services faced in transporting wounded soldiers. Now source B. Same process with this one here. An extract from an article in the Journal of the Royal Army Medical Corps. Admirable as was the organisation of the large base hospitals, the transport of the wounded from the fighting line seems to have been very badly managed during the advance of the Germans through Belgium and northern France. The supply of motor ambulances proved totally inadequate for the slightly wounded, and the slightly wounded had to shift for themselves and squeeze into goods trains. Okay, I'm going to just point out one thing here. If we're talking about the German advance through Belgium and northern France, think about what stage of the war that is. Is it really early in the war or is it later in the war? Because that could be important when you're considering the context of this source. And remember that this question does say, and consider your own knowledge of the historical context. Well, I'm not going to give you an answer to that just now. So hang on there for a moment. You might want to pause the video, make some notes on it before you begin your main answer. And remember, a few minutes spent making annotations on these or making notes on these sources is often well spent when it comes to writing up the final thing. Ready to answer? Okay, 15 minutes. You may begin, and remember, have your timer handy because I'm not going to have a timer on here, otherwise the video will be too long. Get going. Done? Okay, we'll have a look at an example answer later on. For question 3, you will also have 6 minutes. How would you follow up source C to find out more about the nature of wounds soldiers suffered on the Western Front? In your answer, you must give the question you would ask and the type of source you could use. Complete the table. Now, here's the source, and here is the table. In the real exam, you would be given a table that you could write your answers in. You might want to write your answer under a series of headings. I will just say that actually these questions so often catch people out. Don't spend too long on it and don't get too het up over it, and they just require a little bit of practice. Remember, you're not required to actually know the answer to the question that you're asking, and you could choose just about any source as long as it's possible for it to contain relevant and useful information. And just make sure that your question is about the inquiry named in the question itself. So you're meant to be following it up to find out more about the nature of wounds that soldiers suffered on the Western Front. So source C is from the memories of Private Harry Patch of the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry, describing events in 1917. Harry Patch was from the West Country. He was from Somerset, I believe, and he actually was the last British soldier to still be alive after World War I. He died in 2009, aged 113. So luckily for us, he was prepared to talk about his experiences, and this is a source from much later in his life. The shelling was bad. You could hear the big shells coming down, although if you could hear them that was all right. They'd just gone over. You never heard the whiz-bangs coming, they were just there. And you never heard the shell or the bullet that hit you. Of course, whiz-bangs were shrapnel, and that was worse than a bullet. A bullet wound was clean. Shrapnel would tear you to pieces. It was a whiz-bang that killed my 3 friends and wounded me. It was just bad luck. They had those 4 ammunition magazines over their shoulders, fully loaded, and that's why they all got blown to pieces. Alright, pause the video here and answer the question. You might not need all 6 minutes, so just proceed when you're ready. Pause the video and good luck. Done? Alright, we'll have a look at an example answer later on. Question number 4. You've got 6 minutes for this one here as well. What can you infer from source D about the treatment of soldiers in dressing stations? Again, it's a 4-mark answer, so you won't need too long to do it. Here's the source. Let's study it carefully. Source D. An Australian medical officer works on a wounded soldier at an advanced dressing station during the Third Battle of Ypres, better known as Passchendaele, in 1917. Again, by all means, take a screenshot of this, print it out, make some annotations on it, or make some notes on it now. Remember, you're supposed to be making inferences based about the treatments of soldiers in the dressing stations themselves. Pause the video while you prepare, and then we'll crack on. Ready? Well, in the exam, you will be given a form to fill out that will look a little bit like this. Again, you can add these headings to structure your answer if you wish. I can infer, then you say what you can infer, remembering that an inference is going beyond the obvious. Detail in the source that tells me this, and then I can infer again, and the detail in the source that tells me this. Give yourself a maximum of 6 minutes unless you're entitled to extra time, but again, you might not need all of that time. Set your timer now, and then press pause and have a go at the question. Best of luck. Done? All right. So that was the last question. Let's have a look at some example answers. You might want to fetch a second colour of pen or pencil now. A good idea is to review your answers and to attempt to give them a few marks. If you're not confident with the exam board specifications and the mark schemes, then don't worry too much about that. But what you can definitely do is add improvements to your answers based upon the feedback that I'm about to give you. Obviously, I don't know what you've written, so my feedback is going to be fairly general, and it's going to be based upon my experience of actual pupils answering these questions. So hopefully I'll be able to pick up on some of the common mistakes, or more likely, just give some good full answers of my own. So here's an example answer for question 1. Describe 2 features of the evacuation route on the Western Front. 4 marks. Feature 1. My feature is in red, and then the explanation or extra supporting detail is in black. One feature of the evacuation route was the stretcher bearers. These men would transport wounded soldiers from the battlefield to places of treatment like regimental aid posts. Okay, so all of the marks here are for AO1, your knowledge. I've given an example, I've given some supporting details. That's 2 marks so far. Feature 2. Another feature were casualty clearing stations. Here, soldiers were triaged to prioritise who was most seriously hurt and who would be treated first. Alright, pause the video here. Make an estimate as to how many marks you've got. So give yourself a mark for each example and give yourself a mark for each supporting piece of information or explanation. And if you need to make any improvements and add anything, now's a good chance to do it. Press play when you're ready to see the example answer for question 2. Ready? Let's carry on then. Right, question 2 is rather longer and more complicated. This may well become a bit of a confusing mess of different colours and highlighting here. So sorry if it is a bit confusing, but take your time with it, pause it as often as you need to do so. And again, it would be well worth your while playing this full screen and in HD so it's as clear as possible. For this answer, I'm going to make my points in red, examples from the sources are going to be in blue, places where I've used my own knowledge will be in green, and links back to the question and to the inquiry will be in purple. I'll also highlight sections as to where I'm dealing with the usefulness of the sources in green and the limitations with these sources in pink. This should hopefully show to you that I'm not only just focused on the question, but I'm providing an element of balance too. Alright, here's the question again. Study sources A and B. How useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into the problems the medical services faced in transporting wounded soldiers? Explain your answer using sources A and B and your own knowledge of the historical context. In some ways, source A is useful for the inquiry, as it provides evidence about the difficulty of moving wounded men in the terrain of the World War I battlefield. This is useful because it tells us that the stretcher bearers were exhausted and few men could be brought out. From my own knowledge, I know that the mud at Ypres was particularly bad at the Battle of Passchendaele in 1917. However, the source does not tell us whether these conditions were typical. It may be that the conditions near Ypres in 1917 were worse than normal because of the mud and the number of casualties. Source B is also useful for the inquiry, as it indicates how transport of the wounded to the base hospitals was totally inadequate. This is useful because it shows that while the motor ambulances and hospital trains were used in World War I, there were not enough of them to cater for the huge number of casualties. However, the source does not indicate precisely which part of the war it is referring to. The source refers to the advance of the Germans, which could mean that this source is referring to specific difficulties caused by a major German attack, rather than the typical conditions soldiers were moved in. Overall, the sources are quite useful for the inquiry, as they provide detailed accounts of the difficulty in moving the wounded both short distances by the stretchers and longer distances to casualty clearing stations and base hospitals. However, the usefulness of the sources is slightly limited by a lack of information about whether the conditions described is typical of conditions for most of the war. Okay, pause the video now, and maybe this is a good opportunity to make some additions to your own answer. Full disclosure here, I could easily have written more in the time than I have done here, but had I written any more it would have been too small for you to read on the board, so I've tried to be fairly concise. The other thing is here, I do kind of know when that source B was written. It's very likely referring to the advances in 1914. I could have added a piece in here about the fact that the medical services were not exactly geared up in 1914 and that the scale of the casualties was something of a shock. Later in the war, a lot of these problems would have actually been solved. Anyway, I digress. Make your improvements by pressing pause now and rereading the answer. Oh, and I'll go for the uses and limitations in a moment. Alright, ready to see the uses and limitations. The best answers include both the uses and limitations, but ultimately come to a judgment as to how useful they are overall. So by showing you these sections in green, the uses, and the sections in pink, the limitations, I'm showing that I've written a balanced answer here. However, word of warning, I cannot envisage any particular circumstance in which the examiner is going to give you a useless source. In fact, I would argue they don't exist. All sources are useful as long as you're applying them to the right inquiry. It would be a waste of your time, my time, and everyone's time if the examiner gave you a source that wasn't useful. But anyway, here I'm referring to the uses of source A. Here I'm referring to the limitations of source A. Here I'm referring to the uses of source B. Here I'm referring to the limitations of source B. Note that actually what I could have done is I could have dealt with the uses of both sources in one paragraph, the limitations of both sources in one paragraph, and then come to an overall conclusion as to the usefulness of the sources at the end. That would be equally balanced and equally fine. It's just a matter of technique and preference. You can see at the end I've highlighted that they are actually useful in my opinion, even though there are some limitations. Okay, if you're happy with the improvements to your answer, let's move on. Question 3. How would you follow up source C to find out more about the nature of wounds soldiers suffered on the Western Front? Here's what I might have written for this. Detail in source C. Shrapnel would tear you. Okay, I've given that as a quote. Notice that I've got quote marks on the writing. Question I would ask. Were shrapnel wounds more deadly to soldiers than bullets? Alright, have a look at the question again. Is my question focused on the nature of wounds soldiers suffered on the Western Front? Well, I'm asking a question about shrapnel wounds compared to bullets, so yes it is. So that's 2 marks so far. Source I could use. Official statistics of the causes of soldiers' deaths. This was actually recorded. Soldiers were recorded as being admitted with gunshot wounds, shrapnel wounds, and so on and so forth. So this would be an excellent source to find this information for definite. There are loads of different things that you could have chosen. Often a good cop-out is just saying a history book, actually, and more often than not, that will give you an acceptable mark. But now you need to be quite precise as to how specifically your chosen source would give you the answer. And here's how I've assessed mine. You could compare death rates between shrapnel and gunshot wounds. You don't need to take it any further than that. It's only 4 marks. Don't spend long on it. And don't be kind of getting too involved in the idea as to whether or not you actually know where to get that source from. That's not the purpose of this question. Okay, what about question 4? What can you infer from source D about the treatment of soldiers in dressing stations? Right, this is the most common couple of mistakes that people can make with this particular question. The inference has got to be about the inquiry, in other words, the treatment of soldiers in dressing stations. If you were to make an inference like this, I can see that a soldier might be worried about gas because he's wearing a gas mask around his neck. Well, that's not about the treatment of the soldiers, so you wouldn't get a mark for that. If you, on the other hand, said there is a soldier lying on a stretcher, well, that's just an obvious detail of a source. It's not an inference. You wouldn't get a mark for that either. So take more time over the inferences here and then say which particular detail, and be specific about it, you've got that from in the source. Something like this would work well. I can infer that the soldiers could be sedated in dressing stations. Detail in the source that tells me this, well, I've just circled it there. An orderly appears to be using an anaesthetic mask. At dressing stations, soldiers were treated near the front lines. There we go, look at the reinforced building. The advanced dressing station appears to be underground or in a reinforced building to protect it from shellfire. There we go, simple as that. Pause the video here and make some improvements to your own answer. When you're ready, we'll move on. That's it, the end of the unit. That concludes the Medicine on the Western Front unit, and indeed it concludes the whole Medicine Through Time topic. I hope you found it interesting, and I hope you found these lessons useful. This is probably the most detailed and content-heavy unit of the GCSE qualification, so regular revision of the topic is absolutely vital. Best of luck when your training comes to an end, and you attempt the real thing. I hope this lesson has been useful, I hope the whole playlist has been useful, and best of luck when your exams actually come along. If you're not taking the exams, if you've just watched this for your own interest, well, I hope they have been interesting. But for now, it's just time for me to say thank you very much for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I've got loads of other GCSE content on this channel as well. So all the best, and good health.